First thing that broke the room wasn't my sister's voice. It was the way the attorney stopped looking at me when she spoke. Audrey leaned forward in her chair, fingers laced calm and practiced. Before we go any further, she said we should be clear that Leah isn't really part of this discussion. She hasn't been involved. She hasn't been around. And frankly, she doesn't belong in decisions about her mother. No one interrupted her. Not the attorney, not our aunt, not the two cousins who had driven in that morning and now avoided my eyes. I felt the familiar pressure in my chest, the kind that came when a story I didn't recognize was told about me as if it were fact. This wasn't a family meeting, it was a verdict. We were sitting in a small conference room on the 4th floor of a law office in downtown Kansas City. Wednesday afternoon, midweek, mid-March. The windows looked out over traffic crawling along the interstate, ordinary life, moving at a pace that felt insulting given what was happening inside. A leather folder sat in front of Audrey, thick with paper she wouldn't let anyone else touch. I'm Leah Carter. I'm 31 years old. I work in operations for a national freight company, the kind of job that values accuracy and timelines and documentation. I flew in the night before because my mother had been hospitalized and declared temporarily incapacitated. That was the phrase the nurse used on the phone, careful, efficient, impossible to argue with. Audrey had handled everything since. The calls, the updates, the paperwork. She told the rest of the family she was taking care of it. And now apparently she was taking care of me too. She's emotional. Audrey continued, still not looking at me. This is a stressful situation. I think it's best if the conversation stays between people who have actually been responsible. The attorney cleared his throat, eyes flicking down to his notes. He didn't disagree. He didn't agree either. He just let Audrey keep the floor. That's when I understood the danger wasn't just that I was being talked over. It was that decisions were being made while I sat there present but erased. About my mother. About money. About access. About who had the right to ask questions. I looked down at the table and noticed something small. The date written on the top page of Audrey's folder didn't match the week our mother was admitted. It was close enough that no one else would question it. Far enough that my stomach tightened. The attorney asked Audrey to summarize the current arrangement. She did smoothly, too smoothly. She spoke in complete sentences with conclusions already attached. Every sentence placed me further outside the frame. Then there was a pause, a brief one, the kind people don't notice unless they're waiting for something to go wrong. The attorney's phone vibrated against the table. He glanced at the screen, frowned slightly, and set it face down without answering. Audrey didn't see it, or pretended not to. In that moment, I knew this wasn't going to stay a family story. There were too many pieces moving without consent. Too many decisions resting on assumptions that hadn't been checked. Audrey finally looked at me, then just long enough to smile. It wasn't cruel. It was confident. We all know how this is, she said. There's no need to complicate things. I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. I just sat there listening as the story I'd been living inside for years began to slip quietly, almost politely, out of her control. Audrey didn't invent the story about me all at once. She built it slowly, the way people do when they plan to live inside it for a long time. By the time we were adults, everyone seemed to know who I was without ever asking me. I was the difficult one, the unreliable one, the daughter who drifted in and out and only showed up when something was wrong. That version of me followed me into rooms I hadn't entered yet, introduced by Audrey with a sigh and a tone that suggested patience had finally run out. It started years ago after our father died. Grief rearranged the house in ways no one talked about. Audrey moved back in temporarily to help Mom. I lived 3 hours away then, building a life that didn't revolve around weekend visits and constant check-ins. Audrey called it distance. I called it adulthood. Somehow hers sounded more responsible. At the first Thanksgiving after Dad's funeral, Audrey made a point of asking where I'd been when Mom needed help with the guest room. I'd been at the grocery store picking up the extra chairs she'd asked for. Audrey laughed it off in front of everyone. "See," she said, "always missing when it counts." No one challenged her. The comment landed settled and stayed. From there, the details stacked up. A birthday card that arrived late because Audrey forgot to forward the mail became proof I didn't care. A family group text that stopped including me became evidence I wasn't interested. When I questioned something Audrey had already explained, she told people I was confused or emotional, words that sounded reasonable enough to repeat. Audrey never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke calmly, like someone reporting facts. She framed herself as the one holding everything together, the daughter who stayed close, who sacrificed. In comparison, I didn't have to be cruel to look careless. I just had to be elsewhere. I tried to correct the record at first. I'd call our aunt after hearing something strange and explain what had actually happened. A few days later, I'd hear my own words come back to me softened and bent, missing key parts. Audrey had a way of retelling things that made disagreement sound like hostility. Eventually, I stopped arguing. Not because I agreed with her version, but because every attempt to defend myself gave her new material. Silence, I learned, was the only way to avoid being edited. The strange thing was that Audrey never outright accused me of anything serious. She didn't have to. She let people fill in the blanks. If someone wondered aloud why I wasn't around more, Audrey would say, "You know, Leah," and smile. That was enough. By the time Mom's health began to fail, the roles were already assigned. Audrey was the responsible one. I was the question mark. Sitting in that law office the day before, listening to Audrey explain my absence like a flaw in my character, I realized how complete her story had become. It didn't just describe me. It explained me away. And it did something else, something quieter and more dangerous. It gave Audrey authority. If I was unreliable, then she was necessary. If I didn't belong at the table, then she belonged everywhere. I thought about all the times I'd let it go, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. Family dynamics, old habits, harmless exaggerations. Looking back now, I can see the pattern for what it was. Not just favoritism, not just resentment, control. By the end, Audrey wasn't just speaking for me. She was deciding which version of me the family was allowed to know. I didn't argue with Audrey after the meeting. I didn't send follow-up emails or try to clarify anything she'd said. By the time I left the law office that Wednesday afternoon, I understood something I hadn't before. Every explanation I offered became another sentence she could rewrite. So the next day, Thursday, I did something different. I went to see my mother. The hospital was a short drive from where I was staying, a beige building tucked between a pharmacy and a strip mall that still had last winter's salt stains on the sidewalk. I arrived mid-morning after confirming visiting hours. I gave my name at the front desk and waited while the receptionist typed, frowned slightly, and typed again. "You're listed as family," she said. "Careful, but your sister is the primary contact. I'll need to let the floor know you're here." That phrasing caught my attention. Primary contact, not guardian, not power holder, just the person everyone defaulted to. A nurse named Carla came out a few minutes later. She was kind in the practiced way of someone used to navigating tense families. She told me my mother was resting and that the doctor had limited visits earlier in the week due to confusion and agitation. I nodded because that sounded like my mother when she was overwhelmed. "We've been coordinating everything through your sister," Carla added. "She's been very involved." Very involved. Another phrase that could mean anything. When I finally sat by my mother's bed, she looked smaller than I remembered. Her eyes were open but unfocused, drifting past me to the window. I took her hand, and she squeezed it back. After a moment, as if confirming I was real. "Leah," she asked softly. "I'm here," he said. She smiled, then frowned as if the effort cost her something. "Audrey's been helping," she said. "With the papers." "What papers?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She hesitated. "The ones she said I needed to sign." Before I could ask more, Carla returned and gently redirected the conversation, explaining my mother needed rest. I didn't push. I thanked her and stepped back into the hallway, my mother's words echoing louder than they should have. On my way out, my phone buzzed. A missed call from an unknown number, then a voicemail. It was my mother's voice, recorded weeks earlier. She sounded tired, disoriented. She asked me to call her back because Audrey said it was urgent and about getting things settled. There was a pause near the end, long enough to feel deliberate. "I don't really understand it," she said. "But she says it's important." I listened to it twice, standing near the elevators, watching visitors come and go. It wasn't proof of anything, not yet. But it didn't match the version Audrey had presented. That mom was sharp, decisive, and fully in control when everything was arranged. That afternoon, I met my Aunt Marlene for coffee. She's my father's sister, the quiet one in the family who prefers listening to talking. I hadn't planned to bring anything up, but she did. "Your sister's been very protective," Marlene said, stirring her cup. "She doesn't like people questioning things, questioning what I asked." Marlene shrugged. "Timelines? Decisions? Who needs to know what?" Later that evening, back at my rental, I went through my phone. Old messages, missed calls, dates I'd ignored because I didn't know they mattered. One thing stood out, a text from Audrey months earlier, telling me mom was handling everything herself and didn't need visitors. It was sent the same week as the voicemail. For the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt alert. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone of anything, but I was done accepting a story just because it was told confidently. Something about the sequence was off, not dramatic, not obvious, just enough to make me stop reacting and start paying attention. By Friday morning, I had stopped telling myself to calm down, not because I felt panicked, but because calm had become a way to excuse things that no longer fit. The pieces I'd noticed weren't dramatic on their own, but they were consistent. And consistency matters. I returned to the law office just after 10, when the building felt deliberately quiet. The attorney I spoke with this time wasn't the one from Wednesday's meeting. He introduced himself as Mark Ellis, a junior partner who handled document requests and compliance. He was polite, careful, and very clear about what he could and couldn't share. "I'm not asking for decisions," I told him. "I'm asking for copies." That distinction mattered. He explained that any legal authority, Audrey claimed power of attorney authorization to manage assets, medical directives, had to exist as signed dated documents. If they were on file, I had a right to see them as immediate family. He disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a thin folder. Too thin. Inside was a copy of a power of attorney. I recognized my mother's name immediately. I recognized her signature too, or at least I thought I did. The date caught my eye. It was from early February, 2 days after Mom had been taken to the emergency room for what everyone called confusion. "That was finalized during a hospital stay?" I asked. Mark hesitated. "That's what the document indicates." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. When I left the office, the weight in my chest had shifted. It wasn't fear yet. It was pressure, the kind that builds when you realize time has been moving without you. I drove straight to my mother's house. Audrey wasn't there. The driveway was empty, but something else was different. The front door lock had been replaced. I could tell by the shine, by the way my old key slid in and stopped. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, trying to decide if I was overreacting. Then I walked around back and tried the side door. Same thing, new lock. Through the window, I could see the kitchen table. It was bare, too bare. My mother never left it that way. There was always mail. coupons, a half-finished crossword. Someone had cleaned with intention. Later that afternoon, I called my Aunt Marlene. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. Had Audrey mentioned changing the locks? Had she said why certain files were missing from the house? Marlene was quiet for a long moment. She said it was for security, she finally said. That Mom was getting forgetful. Did she ask anyone else before doing it? I asked. No, Marlene said. She doesn't really ask. That evening I went through my notes again. Dates, text messages, the voicemail from my mother, the power of attorney date. Audrey's text telling me Mom was handling everything herself. They didn't line up. What unsettled me most wasn't any single fact. It was the pattern forming around access. Audrey controlled who saw Mom, who spoke for her, who held the paperwork, who had keys. And I was on the outside of all of it. I realized then that this wasn't just about how the family saw me. It was about how the system saw her. Audrey had positioned herself between my mother and everyone else, doctors, lawyers, relatives, and presented that position as necessity. I still didn't know what that meant. Not fully. But I could feel the space narrowing. Decisions had already been made. Doors had already been closed. And if I waited any longer, whatever was happening would be finalized without my voice ever reaching the room. By Saturday afternoon, the questions I'd been carrying stopped feeling theoretical. I hadn't planned to do anything that day. It was the weekend, offices were closed, and there was nothing left to request until Monday. But the sense that I was missing something wouldn't let me rest. Audrey had locked me out of the house, but she hadn't erased the past. Not completely. I went back to my mother's neighborhood, parking a few houses down so I wouldn't draw attention. Mrs. Klein, who lived next door, was outside tending to her rose bushes. She'd known our family for years. Long enough to remember when my father was still alive. Long enough to remember when Audrey didn't live there full time. She recognized me immediately. Leah, she said, surprised. I didn't know you were in town. I just got back, I told her. How's Mom been? Mrs. Klein hesitated, pruning shears frozen in her hand. Oh, well, Audrey's been here a lot. That must have been hard on Mom, I said carefully. Then Mrs. Klein sighed. Your sister worries, she said. But sometimes she doesn't listen. I waited. There were days, she continued, lowering her voice, when your mother seemed confused. Audrey would come out frustrated, saying she needed her to sign something and that it couldn't wait. I thought it was medical paperwork. My stomach tightened. Did you see my mom sign anything? Mrs. Klein shook her head. No, but I heard them arguing. Your mom kept saying she didn't understand. I thanked her and walked back to my car, my hands unsteady on the steering wheel. It still wasn't proof, but it was no longer nothing. That evening I checked the mail at my rental. Among the usual flyers was a plain envelope addressed to my mother, forwarded late. Inside was a notice from her bank dated weeks earlier, confirming that unusual activity on one of her accounts had been reviewed and resolved after customer verification. Customer verification. I read it 3 times. My mother hated automated phone systems. She'd never resolved anything by phone, let alone financial alerts. I called the bank's general number, not expecting answers, just wanting to confirm the notice was real. The representative couldn't discuss details without authorization, but she confirmed the reference number was legitimate. The issue had been flagged, reviewed, and closed. Closed by someone. I sat at the small kitchen table long after the call ended, the paper spread in front of me. Between the power of attorney signed during hospitalization, the changed locks, the voicemail, Mrs. Klein's account, and now this. The shape of something undeniable began to form. This wasn't about misunderstandings or personality conflicts. It wasn't about my absence or Audrey's resentment. It was about access and money and control. I thought about my mother in that hospital bed trying to explain papers she didn't understand. I thought about how confidently Audrey spoke for her, how easily the family accepted it, and I understood the real cost of staying silent. If I did nothing, Audrey's version would harden into fact. Decisions would be finalized. Accounts would be emptied. My mother's voice, already fragile, would disappear completely. I didn't feel angry in that moment. I felt clear. This was the point where pretending it was family business stopped being moral, where loyalty stopped meaning silence. I folded the bank notice carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew this much. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, and whatever came next, there was no going back to being quiet. On Monday morning, I sat in my rental's kitchen with the bank notice in front of me, and my mother's voicemail queued on my phone like a loaded question. I waited until after 9, not because I thought time would make me braver, but because I needed the people I was about to involve to be real people at real desks. If I was going to do this, I wasn't doing it halfway. I called Adult Protective Services first. I'd never spoken to them in my life. The woman who answered introduced herself as Denise and asked me to slow down, start with names, ages, and the immediate concern. "My mother is hospitalized," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "She's been declared temporarily incapacitated. My sister is controlling access to her, and I found documents and financial notices that don't match the timeline." Denise didn't react like it was scandal. She reacted like it was a category. She asked for dates, who was listed as primary contact, whether my mother could speak for herself, whether there was anyone else in the home, whether locks had been changed, whether money had moved. Every question stripped the situation down to facts. It was oddly grounding. When I mentioned the power of attorney date and the bank alert that had been resolved after customer verification, Denise paused. "Do you have copies of those documents?" she asked. "I do," I said. "Not originals. Copies. That's enough to start," she replied. "We can open an intake today." My throat tightened at the word open. This was the line I couldn't step back over. After that, I called the police non-emergency line. I hated doing it, not because I believed Audrey deserved protection, but because calling the police on family is a kind of grief no one prepares you for. The dispatcher transferred me to an officer who worked financial crimes intake. He asked questions similar to Denise's, then gave me a case number and an email address for uploading supporting documents. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from fear of Audrey, but from the sudden understanding that the story was no longer hers to manage. It was now in a system that didn't care who cried louder. I didn't tell Audrey I'd made the calls. I didn't want a scene. I wanted the process. She found out anyway. That afternoon, my phone lit up with messages one after another from Audrey and from numbers I recognized as cousins. Screenshots, half phrases, the familiar tone of concern. Audrey's message was first. "Why are you doing this? Mom is fragile, you're making things worse. Then you always do this. You show up, you create chaos, and you disappear." Then a few minutes later, the part she always saved for last. "People are asking questions about Julia. About whether you're even really family." It was almost comforting in its predictability. When she felt control slipping, she returned to the same weapon. I didn't respond. Not because I was taking the high road, but because I knew any response would be forwarded, interpreted, and used as proof of my instability. Instead, I called the hospital and asked to speak with the social worker on my mother's floor. Her name was Janice. She sounded tired. She confirmed that Audrey was listed as primary contact, and that visiting access could be limited temporarily for patient rest and safety. She also confirmed something else: once a report was made, the hospital would document it and cooperate with the appropriate agencies. That didn't mean immediate action. It meant a paper trail that didn't depend on Audrey's version. By evening, I got a call back from APS confirming my intake had been accepted. They would follow up. They couldn't tell me when. They couldn't tell me what they'd find, but they were in. And that was the moment the risk became real. If this went nowhere, Audrey would tell the family I tried to destroy her. If it went forward, she would fight to keep her grip. Either way, I had just traded silence for consequence. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and by then, everyone knew something was wrong, even if no one could say what it was out loud. Audrey insisted it was just a clarifying conversation. She told relatives it was necessary to calm things down, to correct misunderstandings I had created. The invitation came from the attorney's office, framed as routine, a chance to align before any further decisions were made. The room was larger than the one we'd met in before, with a long table and chairs placed deliberately far apart. Audrey arrived early, already seated, her folder open and squared to the edge like a claim. She looked composed, almost relieved, as if she believed the structure itself would protect her. I took a seat across from her. My Aunt Marlene sat near the window, hands folded, eyes watchful. Two cousins I barely spoke to anymore filled the remaining chairs. The attorney entered last, followed by a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s, plain suit, carrying a slim portfolio. "This is Detective Paul Ramirez," the attorney said. "He's here to collect originals and clarify dates." The air changed immediately. Audrey's smile held for a second too long. The attorney began by stating what the meeting was not. It was not a verdict. It was not an accusation. It was a review of records in light of concerns raised. Then he started laying out dates: hospital admission, power of attorney execution, lock replacement, bank alert resolution. Each event was read plainly without commentary. The words landed differently when no one softened them. When they were placed in order, Audrey interrupted twice, insisting context was missing. The attorney acknowledged her concern and continued. Detective Ramirez asked a single question about access: who had keys, who spoke to the bank, who authorized changes. Audrey answered quickly, too quickly, her voice tight. When the attorney reached the voicemail timeline, he paused and looked at me. I nodded. He summarized it without playing it. He didn't need to. The date was enough. Across the table, one of my cousins shifted in her seat. "That's not what we were told," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Audrey turned toward her. "You don't understand," she said. Mom was confused. I was protecting her. Detective Ramirez asked Audrey to clarify how customer verification had occurred on the bank account. She said she'd helped Mom through it. He asked if there was a record of that call. Audrey said she assumed so. The attorney didn't look up when he said, "We've requested it." That was when Audrey's confidence faltered. Not collapsed, just cracked. The meeting ended without conclusions. No one was removed. No decisions were announced. But something irreversible had happened. The story Audrey had told for years, about my unreliability, my absence, my interference, was no longer the only version in the room. As we stood to leave, Audrey pulled me aside. Her voice dropped, urgent. "You've made this worse," she said. "They're watching now. If something happens to Mom..." "If something happens to Mom," I said evenly, "it won't be because someone asked questions." She stared at me, searching for the old response. The apology, the retreat. It didn't come. Outside, the hallway buzzed with normal office noise. Phones ringing, doors closing, life continuing as if nothing had shifted. But it had. For the first time, Audrey didn't walk out ahead of me narrating the aftermath. She lingered, speaking in low tones to the attorney. Her folder no longer a shield. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exposed. The timeline was out there now, incomplete but undeniable. And with it came risk. Because when control starts to slip, the person who held it doesn't let go quietly. The morning after the meeting, I woke up with the uncomfortable clarity that comes when adrenaline wears off. Nothing had been resolved. The timeline had been read aloud, yes, but Audrey was still free to tell her version in every other room I wasn't standing in. I'd exposed the cracks. I hadn't controlled the fallout. That was my mistake. By Friday afternoon, the messages started again. Not directly from Audrey this time, but from family members who hadn't been in the room. People who just wanted to understand. People who were suddenly concerned about motives instead of dates. Audrey had shifted tactics. She wasn't arguing facts anymore. She was questioning my right to question them. She told people I was overreacting, that I'd always resented her closeness to Mom, that my absence over the years meant I didn't really know what Mom wanted. She didn't deny the paperwork existed. She reframed it as necessity. "She's emotional," one cousin told me on the phone. "Audrey's just practical." That word practical kept coming up, as if control and care were interchangeable, as if being decisive erased the need for consent. For the first time, I understood something crucial. Audrey wasn't trying to win the investigation. She was trying to win the narrative around it. And I'd let her. I spent the rest of the day doing something I hadn't done before. I stopped reacting outward and started organizing inward. I laid everything out on the dining table of my rental: copies of documents, dates, notes from conversations, names of people who'd said things casually that now felt important. When you put chaos into order, patterns stop being scary. They become usable. One pattern stood out immediately. Every decision Audrey defended as what Mom wanted happened in moments when Mom couldn't speak clearly for herself. Every justification Audrey offered relied on interpretation, never direct confirmation. That was the gap. I called the hospital and asked for a formal capacity assessment update. Not an opinion, a documented evaluation. I emailed the attorney requesting that all future communication include written summaries, not verbal assurances. I forwarded APS, the neighbor's account, carefully without commentary. I didn't accuse Audrey of lying. I let the record show where certainty was assumed. That evening, Aunt Marlene came by. She didn't announce it. She just knocked holding a grocery bag, like an excuse. "I should have said something sooner," she said once we were seated. But Audrey always made it sound urgent, like there was no time. "Urgency is a powerful tool," I said. Marlene nodded. "I remembered something after the meeting," she added. "Your mother asked me once why Audrey needed so many signatures. That was it. Not proof, not yet, but corroboration." For the first time since this started, I felt something shift back toward me. Not victory, control. Audrey was still speaking loudly, still reframing, still trying to make this about my character instead of her actions. But I wasn't trying to outtalk her anymore. I was building something quieter, a record that didn't need defending, a sequence that spoke for itself. The system was slow, I knew that. It didn't reward emotion or punish tone. It responded to consistency. And for the first time, consistency was on my side. By the following Wednesday, the process Audrey had dismissed as overblown stopped feeling abstract. It started quietly, the way real consequences usually do. No confrontation, no raised voices. Just notifications, confirmations, and people who suddenly wouldn't return her calls. That morning I received an email from APS confirming that a formal investigation had been opened. The language was careful and impersonal. They acknowledged receipt of supplemental information and noted cooperation from the hospital and financial institutions. No conclusions, no promises, just movement. An hour later, the attorney forwarded another update. The bank had escalated its review. Pending the outcome, certain accounts connected to my mother were temporarily restricted. Not closed, not seized, restricted. Audrey found out before I did. She called me for the first time since the meeting. Her voice was tight, stripped of the practiced calm she'd used for years. "Did you know about this?" she demanded. "The bank says I can't access Mom's account." "I know they were reviewing it," I said. "That's all." "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "She needs that money for care." "So do the doctors," I said. "So does the hospital. That's why they're involved now." She went quiet. Then her voice dropped sharp and low. "You did this to punish me." I closed my eyes, not in anger, but in exhaustion. "I did this because it wasn't optional anymore." She hung up. That afternoon, Detective Ramirez contacted me directly. He explained that they were collecting statements and original documents. Audrey had been advised not to move funds or alter access pending review. He didn't use the word suspect. He didn't need to. The hospital followed suit. A revised care plan was issued listing an independent case manager alongside Audrey. Visiting access was clarified. Notes were documented. For the first time since this began, Audrey wasn't the sole voice in the room. The family reacted exactly the way families do when reality intrudes. Some went silent. Some reached out cautiously, asking what would happen next. A few accused me of tearing the family apart. I didn't argue with any of them. There was nothing left to defend. The record existed now. It didn't require belief. Late that evening, Aunt Marlene called. "Audrey came by," she said. "She was angry, said you'd ruined everything." "Did she say what everything was?" I asked. Marlene paused. "Control," she said finally. That word settled heavy and final. I thought about the months Audrey had spoken for my mother. The signatures she'd gathered. The locks she'd changed. The way she'd always framed urgency as virtue. Now the urgency belonged to her. She was the one racing against a system she couldn't rush or charm. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt braced. Because justice, I was learning, doesn't arrive like relief. It arrives like weight. It demands patience. It demands that you hold your ground while other people face the consequences of choices they insisted were harmless. By the end of the week, Audrey's authority had been formally limited. Not erased, not punished yet, but contained. The highest risk was still ahead. Investigations can stall. Institutions can hesitate. Outcomes are never guaranteed. But the balance had shifted. The story Audrey controlled for years no longer mattered. The facts did. The final decision didn't arrive with drama. It arrived in writing. 2 weeks after the accounts were restricted, the attorney called to confirm what everyone had already begun to accept. An independent guardian had been appointed temporarily. Audrey's authority over my mother's finances and medical decisions was formally suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. The language was precise, careful, and final in the only way that mattered. Audrey did not call me after that. I heard about her through others, that she was angry, that she was telling people she'd been misunderstood, that she was exhausted from explaining herself to systems that didn't bend the way family once had. None of it changed the record. None of it changed who now held the keys. The hospital room felt different the next time I visited. Not warmer, not happier, just quieter. My mother was still fragile, still confused at times, but the questions were no longer rushed. Decisions were documented. Conversations were witnessed. No one spoke for her without writing it down. I sat with her by the window and held her hand. She looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for something familiar. "You came back," she said. "Yes," I replied. "I'm here." That was enough. In the weeks that followed, I made choices that had nothing to do with Audrey. I declined invitations to clear the air. I didn't attend family meetings framed as reconciliation. I let people sit with the discomfort of not knowing where they stood with me. I also made one practical decision that felt heavier than I expected. I asked the attorney to begin the process, of selling my mother's house once it was appropriate. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. Too many locks had been changed there, too many conversations controlled. It was no longer a place of safety. Aunt Marlene supported the decision without question, others didn't. I accepted both reactions without explanation. As for Audrey, the consequences continued without my involvement. The investigation moved at its own pace. The bank maintained restrictions. Her access remained limited. The role she'd built indispensable, unquestioned central, was gone. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. For years I tried to earn my place by being quieter, more agreeable, less present. I'd let someone else define what belonging looked like, and then punish myself for failing to fit it. What I learned through all of this was simpler than I expected. Belonging isn't granted by whoever controls the story. It's claimed by refusing to participate in a lie. I returned to my life in Kansas City with a different posture, not defensive, not watchful, just steady. I answered my phone when I wanted to. I visited when it made sense. I stopped explaining choices that were already justified by the facts. The story ended when the system took over. Healing began when I stopped replaying it. I didn't get my family back. I got something quieter and more durable. My voice. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear what justice has looked like in your own family, or what healing meant when the truth finally surfaced. If you found value here, consider subscribing for more stories like this, and feel free to explore another one waiting for you next. Thank you for listening.